From being the top owner of an investment company and having a great and loving family to his generation being wiped out from the surface of planet Earth, this is the case of Amarjit Chauhan and his family. On the other hand, police traveled to India, France, Belgium, and the United States and collected 4,000 documents in efforts to crack the case. Will they be able to uncover this sinister crime? Or will the culprits get away with this horrific crime? Keep watching till the end to find out. This is Unsolved Files, a place where crime stories are being brought to your doorstep. What are you waiting for? Just hit the subscribe button for more fascinating and suspense-filled crime stories. Now let's get back into this story and uncover this mystery. Now, the story began with the business career of Amarjit Chauhan. 46-year-old Amarjit, also known as Anil, was born in India and came to England in his early 20s to make his fortune, and it worked. By 2003, he was the owner of a successful haulage company, Saiba Freight, based close to the international airport at Heathrow. People he knew and worked with thought he was relaxed and friendly. His business style was informal, but obviously successful, and he was always on the lookout for new money-making opportunities. On February 13, 2003, he apparently leaves his office to travel to Wiltshire to meet a man who says he's interested in buying his company for £3 million in cash. Unfortunately, he didn't tell anyone exactly where he was going or the name of the person he was planning to meet, but Chauhan didn't come back from the meeting that day, the next day, and the day after that. This simply means that Amarjit Chauhan has disappeared. Colleagues at Saiba Freight decided to tell the police he was missing, but experienced detectives know that a missing persons report can mean many different things. Now, back in 1996, he'd been convicted on 13 charges of tax evasion and had been sentenced to 3 years in prison. He had a reputation for cutting business corners and for financial tricks, which he said he'd learned in jail. He knew some pretty shady people, some of whom he'd also met while serving his sentence. This was a man with things to fear and things to hide. This was a man with a lot of cash and a business that made more cash every day, so he was both vulnerable and in trouble. So there was no immediate reason for anyone to be seriously worried, but Chauhan himself was in really deep trouble, and there was no way he could tell anyone what was happening. Now, as those horrible experiences were happening to Chauhan, he has 2 young boys, aged just 2 months and 18 months, and the wife's mother was on a visit from India. They were surprised by a knock on the door. However, 2 men pushed their way in and forced the 2 women and the 2 little children out of the house and into a hired van. The van drives off at speed. With this, there are no family members left to tell anyone about it or to raise the alarm. Chauhan's work colleagues reported him missing, but they didn't know his family had also vanished. Not all missing person reports are treated the same by the police, but back at the bungalow in Wiltshire, where Chauhan is being held prisoner, something else was going on. Chauhan is being forced to sign several blank sheets of headed paper from his own freight company. The kidnappers clearly have business on their minds. Looking at this quiet, dead-end street for themselves, Ryan Hook can see that whatever was happening in this bungalow must have been in plain sight of the neighbors. The bungalow was occupied by one Mr. Kenneth Reagan and his father. No one in the street knew that a businessman was missing from home, but they must have thought something odd was going on. Whatever Mr. Chauhan's abductors had planned seemed to be going smoothly, and it might have stayed that way for even longer. But however, Mrs. Chauhan had a brother who lived halfway around the world in New Zealand. For 3 weeks, he tried to reach his sister on the phone without success. Finally, he gave up and got on a plane to see what was going on. When he got to his sister's house, he found the house empty and no sign of any single member of the family. He raised the alarm and called the police. This all takes time. It seems incredible, but Chauhan and his whole family have now been missing for nearly 2 months. However, 4 days after Mr. Chauhan first disappeared, the company was bought by someone called Kenneth Reagan, and CBA was being run as normal under new ownership. People who worked there weren't all that surprised or suspicious. They just thought it was another example of Chauhan's not very orthodox business methods. But the missing Mrs. Chauhan's brother didn't give up. So he placed more pressure that made the Metropolitan Police pass the case to the Serious Crime Directorate in Scotland Yard. On March 21st, 2003, for the first time, they took a statement from the new owner, Kenneth Reagan. Reagan shows all his ownership documents to Scotland Yard's detectives. It all looks above board. Former Detective Chief Inspector Dave Little later passed the case on when he reviewed the available information because the alarm bell started ringing. The next month, Scotland Yard quietly reviewed the case. They tracked down Chauhan's family home in India, and they sent a team to Punjab. Do you think that just maybe the new owner of Chauhan's company was involved in his disappearance? Let's not be too quick to conclude. Let's find out. Now, Kenneth Reagan is very much on the police radar, and the worst is yet to come. The missing persons case is about to become a multiple murder inquiry. In the early months of 2003, the mystery unfolded and turned into the longest murder trial in the history of the Metropolitan Police. The police investigation took detectives to India, the United States, and 3 other European countries. At first, it was a case of missing persons, but in April 2003, it became something different. In the early hours of the 22nd of April, just 2 days after Easter Sunday, a lone boating enthusiast was peacefully paddling around Bournemouth Pier on the south coast of England when he bumped into something floating in the water, and he called the local police. However, the object in the water turned out to be a dead body that had been there for some time. The police called in a local pathologist. When the body was taken to the mortuary, the hunt for his identity begins. Although the body was severely decomposed, the police managed to take his fingerprints. And surprisingly, the fingerprint of the hand showed a criminal record for fraud. His fingerprints are on file, and the body floating in the water was that of the missing businessman. At this point, the Chauhan case lands on Detective Chief Inspector Dave Little's desk. Nevertheless, there were clear signs that Chauhan had been murdered. He had a very severe head wound, and the remains of a gag were on his face. This was no accidental drowning. And now, the only leads that the Chief Inspector Little has is Seba Freight, Chauhan's old company, and its new owner, Kenneth Reagan. The 55-year-old Reagan may not have had the looks of a wealthy playboy and international criminal mastermind, but that's how he saw himself. Back in 1997, as the money rolled in from his drug smuggling enterprises, he was called Ken Avery and drove around in a Mercedes, reveling in the nickname of Captain Cash. But he sailed too close to the wind, and in 1998, he was jailed for his involvement in a heroin smuggling ring and a passport racket. Avery had no intention of spending valuable time in prison. He turned on his co-defendants, gave evidence against them, and was rewarded with a shorter sentence of just 4 years. In 2003, Avery was out of jail, and he'd changed his name to Reagan and was the new owner of Seba Freight. He asked a woman friend called Belinda Bruin to join the company as managing director and credit controller. He offered her a salary of £72,000 for a position for which she had no qualifications whatsoever. Ken and Belinda's relationship goes back to 1997, when they met in the ritzy top-floor bar of Harvey Nichols, one of London's smartest department stores. Reagan showers her with offers of glamorous trips and expensive gifts. Their relationship fizzles out while Reagan is in jail, but he sends a condolence note to her when he reads about the death of a celebrity friend, and he looks her up when he's released. Her own life has taken a turn for the worse. Although she has the outward trappings of wealth, her partner has by now left her. She's left with mortgage repayments and school fees, and she risks losing her 50-acre estate in Devon. Reagan is recently out of jail and needs someone to run the company he has acquired, someone he can use as a respectable front. So when she's strapped for cash, he persuades her to join his newly acquired company, Seba Freight. Before we go carry on, remember to subscribe to our channel, Unsolved Files, where we bring you deeper views of criminal and unsolved cases. Please give this video a thumbs up, share, and comment. Let us know what you think about it. At this stage, Chief Inspector Little had no way of connecting Kenneth Reagan to the killing, but it was Reagan himself who handed the police the clues they needed because he panicked. On the day Mr. Chauhan had left his office for the last time, he was actually going to meet Reagan on the pretext of a business proposition. When he got to the meeting point in Stonehenge, Reagan, along with his 2 accomplices, William Hornsey and Peter Rees, forced Chauhan into their van and drove him to Reagan's father's house, where they held him captive. But however, 2 days later, Reagan and Hornsey traveled back to London and persuaded Mrs. Chauhan, her 2 little children, and her mother to leave with them. They were bundled into the van and taken to Wiltshire to be united with Mr. Chauhan. Sometime over the next 4 days, the entire family was murdered and their bodies were taken to Tiverton in Devon, where they were buried in a field. So far, Reagan's crime was completely undetected. There was nothing to connect him directly to the family's disappearance. Reagan might have gotten away with his crime, but then he made a very huge mistake. If Reagan had just left the Chauhan's family's bodies buried where they were, things might have been different, but he senses the police are closing in on him, and from his point of view, he made the wrong choice. He told police he had a meeting arranged with the missing man near a bronze statue of a pig in South Wales, and all they had to do was come along and watch. However, undercover detectives monitor the rendezvous point in the center of Newport, South Wales, but of course, Chauhan fails to turn up. Reagan thought he'd laid a false trail to throw the police off him, but on Easter Saturday, Reagan and his accomplices went back to Devon and dug up the 5 bodies, 2 months after they were murdered. Reagan bought a boat, and the next day, the 3 of them sailed out to see the whole show. The whole Chauhan family was brutally disposed of and tickled into the cold waters of the English Channel. Reagan thought this would put him in a clear slate, the bodies would never be found, and the police would have no leads. He thought from his previous encounters with police that he had special insight into their way of thinking. The question now is, where's the rest of Mr. Chauhan's family? Obviously, the first thing the police did was search Chauhan's home in London for evidence. And just then, Dave Little got some very interesting news from the pathologist who had examined the body of Mr. Chauhan. And there was also one more surprise to come. The condition of Chauhan's body suggested to the pathologist that he might have been buried on land before being dumped in the sea. And there was a further sign that Chauhan's body might have been dug up from a grave. In any case, experienced detectives know where to start looking when they're searching for the grave of a crime victim. Meanwhile, Melinda Bruin was interviewed, and she let slip that she knows about the hoax meeting at the Bronze Pig in South Wales, and that's the piece of the jigsaw puzzle Dave Little needed. And Dave Little suspects that Reagan would have thought that Belinda Bruin's spacious grounds in Devon were a safe place to bury a body. With that in mind, Detective Little took a team down to her country estate. He had good reason to think Reagan might have been there. The police dug a trench in the grounds of Belinda Bruin's estate and found what they're looking for, although far too big for one body. This could have been the burial site for an entire family. It was more and more clear that the police were dealing with multiple killings. Belinda Bruin said she had no idea the bodies were buried on her land. It was indeed clear that the whole family has been murdered. Now it's not just the family that was murdered. 3 generations was wiped out. Does that mean Reagan didn't want anyone coming back to claim Cybe Freight? Wait until you see the end of this intriguing and disheartening story. Now the detectives have to track down Kenneth Reagan and put together the evidence they need to take him to court so he can pay for his callous crime. Mr. Chauhan was definitely a murder victim, and his body had been found. His wife, mother-in-law, and 2 children were still missing, but the size of the grave found in Devon offered a grim clue to their fate. And Detective Chief Inspector Dave Little is closing in on his prime suspect, Kenneth Reagan. A criminal can use a pressure hose and think he's washed away all traces of his crime. But in reality, the hose makes the job easier for the police. But it's not all plain sailing for DCI Little and his team. Reagan's home address is his father's bungalow in Wiltshire. Everything points to this, being where Chauhan was held and probably where the rest of his family were brought to. There's a strong possibility that this is where all of them were killed, according to the assumption of the detectives. To clear all doubt, the crime scene team was sent in. When they arrived, the whole place had been cleared of any evidence. Now, while there may not have been much forensic evidence, there was enough to convince the police that this was the right place. Yes, it was a slaughterhouse where Chauhan was held for 3 days, drugged and gagged, forced to make telephone calls to his family and sign away his freight company to Ken Reagan. But Chauhan showed extraordinary bravery during his ordeal. While left alone in the bungalow, he found some letters with Reagan's address on them. He picks one up and writes a message on it about what was happening, folds it into quarters, then eighths, and slips it inside his sock. He puts his shoe back on and waits for his fate. But this was not discovered until pathologist Basil Purd went through Chauhan's clothes at the time of the initial autopsy. After the autopsy, a forensic scientist routinely analyzed Chauhan's personal effects and clothing. He found the astonishing and vital clue still stuck inside Chauhan's sock. With this discovery, Dave Little's evidence against Reagan and his accomplices was mounting. Now all he has to do is find him and bring him to justice. On the day that Reagan and his accomplices dumped the Chauhan family in the sea, they went on the run. Well, can they run forever? Just wait and see. On November 8, 2004, Kenneth Reagan and his 2 accomplices, William Hornsey and Peter Reese, were brought to the Old Bailey. After an 8-month murder trial, Reagan and Hornsey were convicted of Mr. Chauhan's and his family's murder and received whole life sentences. Reese got 15 years convicted of just Chauhan's murder. The actual cause of their death has never been fully established, but police believe all the family members were probably strangled. However, the bodies of the 2 Chauhan's children were never found. Their grandmother's body washed up on the Isle of Wight in September 2003, and their mother was hauled up in a fishing net. This was a killing motivated by greed alone. A man who wanted cash quickly. A man ruthless enough to kill an entire family in order to steal their business. A man willing to cross the line to get what he wanted. Is that your thinking too, and are you happy Reagan got what he deserved? Well, let us know what your thoughts are about this pathetic story in the comment section below. Now, some of these crimes are just so sad and horrific that you can't help but feel sad for the victims. Just like the case of this ruthless criminal. Go watch it now. It's on your screen. The Butcher of Kansas City. The case of Robert Berdella. What are you waiting for? Go watch it now because this video has ended.